Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Thomas Mattair. Dr. Mattair was the executive director of the Middle East Policy Council from 2009 to 2020. He also served as research scholar at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research in Abu Dhabi, where he researched and wrote the 3 occupied UAE islands, the Tums and Musa. He also is the author of Global Security Watch, Iran, and many other articles. Tom, welcome. Come on up. How are you? Good. The floor is yours.
Did I sit?
If you like, or are you more comfortable up here, it's your call. Would you like to speak from here and then have a discussion? Up to you.
Yeah, just for 1 minute.
You got it?
Welcome, everyone. As you can see, this is the second part of a discussion on regional dynamics. So I expect us to be discussing next steps in the conflict between Israel and Iran Iran is vulnerable now, so we will explore what Israel may be thinking of. And of course, our luncheon speakers, distinguished luncheon speakers, spoke about the importance of resolving the Palestinian question, and wonder what the administration's interest in doing this is, and then what will the attitude of the GCC states and the other Arab states be about possible escalation of the Israeli-Iran conflict, or a failure to resolve the Palestinian issue. I see that one of our scheduled speakers is here, so I'll introduce him, Dr. Hussein Ibish.
Hi, everybody.
Senior research scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute, columnist for The National, columnist for the International New York Times.
Well, not anymore.
Okay.
They don't love me anymore. The Atlantic.
Okay. The term must read is sometimes overused, but I consider Hussein's work to be must read work. Not only has he written about Palestinian issues, but he's also written about Arab American problems in our society. And so that may lead us into a discussion of American attitudes toward these issues. Mm-hmm. Not administration attitudes, but popular attitudes. Ambassador Jeffery does not appear to be here.
Not yet.
And neither does Mona. Neither does Mona, which is a shame, because Jim has held a number of very senior positions in the American government.
Don't dwell on it.
And but we have William Lawrence,
Yay!
who you know, and I believe you are Abbas.
Dr.
Fadi Hilal.
I'm sorry. Okay, well, thank
Already
you.
been introduced, so you can cut to the chase.
Okay, so let me sit down and
Wonderful.
ask our panelists to begin speaking.
Thank you very much.
I think we will be taking questions from the floor. If you want to write them, don't wait until all the speakers are finished. Please give me a little chance to organize them. But we might be able to take questions
microphone.
orally.
Yeah, use the mic. No.
Can you hear me now?
No. Use mic.
Okay, now.
Oh, that's it.
Okay, so without further ado, Hussein, would you begin?
Well, yes, but would you ask me a question? Or what would you like me to address? Because we've got about 6 different things on the table. So give me a bit of direction and I'll charge off.
Well,
Okay, I'll just go ahead. Fine. So in comes Donald Trump, the great deal maker, the art of the deal. And we had 4 years of his deal-making prowess on the international stage, and I would argue he came up with precisely 0. You might consider the Abraham Accords a deal he struck, but the fact is that the administration fell in backwards into the Abraham Accords. They created the crisis, which was the invitation to Israel in the Peace to Prosperity plan that was issued under the direction of Jared Kushner in January of 2000, which invited or anticipated Israel annexing 30% more of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley, which importantly would leave the rest of Palestinian territory, such as it is, entirely surrounded by a new greater Israel. And Prime Minister Netanyahu was in the middle of a bunch of inconclusive elections, which he was unable to resolve fully. And he was facing another vote, and he ran on implementing this annexation plan, and he won. And once he won, his colleagues and supporters turned to him and said, right, you said you would implement this on day one, go for it. But of course he didn't want to do that because Netanyahu is fundamentally a cautious politician who does not apparently believe, and I think it's still true, that annexation is ripe yet. He's working towards that. He's been working towards that, I believe, his whole career, and I don't think he hides it. But I think he probably views annexation as something either to be the very last crowning achievement of his career or more likely something for his successor. And he's just not a particularly risk-taking kind of guy. And since annexation would be changing the sign over the door rather than any fundamental change in the structure of Israeli-Palestinian relations between the river and the sea, there's no need to do it. It's all sort of downside, really. It doesn't really have an upside practically for Israel, and a cautious politician won't do it, therefore. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is reacting with horror because he had certainly regarded this as a second-term project. He was already sort of in this imbroglio of a very difficult re-election, which he lost. He won't admit it, but he did. And facing also the COVID pandemic. And the last thing he wanted was yet another brouhaha about Israel and the Palestinians, especially one that could be laid at his doorstep. So neither Netanyahu nor Trump wanted to go ahead with the annexation, and in swooped the UAE with this brilliant idea of exchanging non-annexation for 5 years in exchange for normalization with Israel, which Bahrain then joined for its own reasons. And the 5 years is very interesting because it was 5 years, even though it's an informal understanding, it was a firm one. The first year was designed to cover the last year of the Trump administration, and then 4 more years for a prospective second term. In other words, it was 5 Trump years. No other reason for that 5 years. It doesn't come from any other source. It comes from Donald Trump. But he really didn't want this to happen, and that's why I think that they kind of fell backwards into this success. They really were not the architects of it. The architects of it were Yusuf al-Otaiba and Anwar Gargash in the UAE, not Kushner and Trump, and certainly not Netanyahu. But there it is. So the deal maker now confronts, I would argue, 3 potential deals or problems that might be resolved through an understanding in the Middle East. And I'll go through them from the least likely of success to the most likely of success, even though that also is really a long shot, because it kind of comes back to the first one. But let me start with the most difficult one. That's an Israeli-Palestinian. It wouldn't even be a final status agreement. That's not possible. But a resumption of dialogue about some sort of eventual final status agreement. That in itself would be a monumental achievement, right? Because the last time we had any conversation whatsoever about this was the first Obama term and the settlement freeze fiasco, which was the final nail in the coffin of Oslo-era diplomacy. And we've had nothing whatsoever since. And if you could restart that, it would be pretty remarkable, especially if it were based on the understanding that this is designed to culminate in a Palestinian state. In other words, what you need to do to make it meaningful would be to take Oslo and add Dayton to it. Because the problem with Oslo is that you took two parties of radically unequal power, probably the biggest power asymmetry in modern history for an extended national negotiation. I mean, nuclear Israel versus the Palestinians who've never had a tank in their history, frankly. I mean, not really. I guess in Lebanon there were sort of armored vehicles, but no tank as such. So, you know, the power asymmetry is very remarkable. And expect them on their own with some guidance to come to terms. It was just sort of absurd. And what you'd have to add is an element of Dayton. It was in Dayton, in the former Yugoslavia, what basically was done, to put it very simplistically, but it's true, is there was a mutual understanding about the eventual outcome of, you know, having sort of these different states with relations with each other, and then they negotiated backwards to get to that point. And to make Palestinian-Israeli negotiations meaningful, you'd have to add a Dayton element to Oslo. In other words, have some clarity about the outcome. And the outcome has to be two states. Now, there's a lot of wiggle room in that. What's a state, right? What constitutes a Palestinian state? What lack of sovereignty, what sovereign restrictions might stop a Palestinian state from constituting a state? Those are, what would be the boundaries of that state? What would be Israel's extraterritorial rights in that state? Because there would be some. All of those questions are TBD. You know, what happens to the settlements? What about borders? All that stuff. Certainly the state would be non-militarized. The PLO has wanted to have a non-militarized state since the 90s. They don't talk about it, but that's been their conclusion. Like, what would they do with the military? Frankly, it would be pointless, more pointless than the LAF. And so they really don't want to go there, but they don't want it to be an Israeli demand. At this point, though, it will be an Israeli demand. We're sort of beyond that. So I think that's the most difficult deal. And I don't think he'll try, because I don't think he'll get it. And I don't think Israel is interested in this, and why would they be? From the point of view of Greater Israel advocates, they are winning big time on the ground. And why would they do anything to mess that up? The current coalition has a very interesting stipulation, little known, but very important, in the coalition agreement. In Israel, coalitions tend to have sort of manifestos that guide the work of the coalition, understandings about policy direction that underpin the coalition that makes up the governing majority in the Knesset. And this one, of course, has one. And in it, there is a paragraph or a line or something that says that Jews only enjoy self-determination and sovereignty in Eretz Israel. Now, the nation-state law says that about Medinat Israel, which is the state of Israel. The coalition agreement says it about Eretz Israel. Eretz Israel is different. Eretz Israel means the whole thing, from the river to the sea. So that is actually the policy of this coalition government. And shifting that is going to be very difficult. You'll note that after October 7, even before, but especially after that, you have to go very far into the Israeli left. You have to get to Meretz before you start hearing people talking seriously about a Palestinian state. So I don't think this deal is on the table. Yeah, exactly, all 5 Meretz members, yeah. Then the second deal, which is plausible, but will be very hard to do, would be another agreement with Iran, right? Now, in the first administration, we had a period of maximum pressure after Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. We had a year of maximum pressure, which taught the Iranians an interesting lesson, which was that their economy could survive the onslaught of full-on unilateral American sanctions without the Russians and the Chinese and all of that, but just the US turning the screws. So the second year was a year of maximum resistance to maximum pressure. A lot of low-intensity warfare, deniable stuff, limpet mines above and below the waterline, you know, drone strikes that were with plausible deniability, all kinds of cyber attacks and things like that, mainly targeting Gulf Arab interests. And it all culminated with the September 2019 attacks on the Aramco facilities Abqaiq and Khurais in Saudi Arabia that were initially and laughably blamed on the Houthis, but of course was the work of Iran, as any person with any mukh knew immediately, was seeing it. No way the Houthis, even with Hezbollah guidance, could have done that. And they didn't.
That's half a mukh.
It's half a mukh, fine. It works for me. It's a nitwit for those who don't. That's Arabic for nitwit, yeah. Anyway, yeah, we don't have a good English word for mukh, really. It's sort of horse sense or something like that. But anyway, so this left, what's important about this is that the Trump administration did not have a consensus about what the purpose of all this pressure was. Some people in the administration thought it was to create the conditions for regime change. That's one kind of goal. Other people in the administration thought they were squeezing the Iranians to make them come to terms for a better deal than the JCPOA. Those are two absolutely different goals, and they lead policy to diverge in dramatic ways at certain moments. But it never came to that because Trump lost the election. But since we're going back to maximum pressure, the question will be, is this maximum pressure to squeeze the Iranians to soften them up for a better deal? Are we turning off, are we going to treat them like tenants, obstreperous tenants in a Trump-branded property in New York who don't want to move out? And so we're going to cut off their electricity, cut off their water, not pick up the garbage, and play loud music all night. Is that what we're doing? And then so they'll move out, or they'll come and we'll buy them out in the condo. Or are we just trying to kill them? You know, is it for regime change? And it'd be very important to find out early on what the purpose of this is. If the purpose is to soften them up, and it doesn't go on long enough that the Iranians give up on their overtures right now to come to terms, which they've been making even before Hezbollah fell apart, but especially since the pager explosions and the kind of the way that their strategy of national security through a forward defense based on Arab militias kind of fell apart. So they are softened up already. Now, if you put the maximum pressure on, you'd better not wait around too long before trying to cash it in. But if that's the case, it's possibly doable, right? But if this is back to either regime change or no consensus, it's going to be very, very hard. And I think it's going to be hard anyway, because I'm sure that the U.S. is going to want to talk about Iranian proxy groups and missiles arsenals, which the Iranians wouldn't talk about back in 2015 and 2016. And now I think you could get the militia groups on the table, but probably not the missiles. So anyway, that's possible. The last deal is the easiest one. Which is not to say it's easy. It's not easy, and I don't think it'll happen, but it's the most doable. And that would be a return to the Biden administration's effort to forge a triangular agreement between the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. It's doable because all three countries want it. And they know they want it. They blatantly want it. They make no bones about wanting it. The question is the terms. Now, this negotiation, I know I'm going on a little bit, but I'm trying to be thorough here. And okay, good, then I will. This negotiation is a triangular one because Saudi Arabia and Israel don't have diplomatic relations. So there are two parallel lines. The US is the hypotenuse. And their first bilateral negotiation was between Riyadh and Washington, and it was about a new US-Saudi defense pact, ironclad, as the Saudis say, and the Emiratis also say, because they figure they'll get the same deal afterwards, which they will, if it ever happens. And it would be based on the agreements, security agreements reached in the 1950s between the US and South Korea and Japan separately. It'd be something like that. Less than NATO, but much more than the kind of super consultation and closer relations that Bahrain and then the UAE got this year. It has to be better than that. It has to be ratified by the Senate, and there's the rub. But they also want, of course, an agreement for US oversight of Saudi nuclear enrichment and production for energy, just so that it doesn't come between the two countries, very importantly. And by all accounts, from both sides, these negotiations were virtually complete. The mutual defense agreement is basically a done deal, as I understand it. And the nuclear agreement was sort of widely agreed in principle with some details to be worked out. The problem is that from the outset, the Saudis required more for the Palestinians than a settlement abstention. And what they need, especially after the Gaza war, is Israel to do something they have never done before, which is recognize the Palestinian right to a state between the river and the sea, to stop the Gaza war and to enter into negotiations to create that state. The challenge for Trump, and I'm going to wrap up with this, is doable. He'll have to get the war over, or get some kind of declaration that the war is over, get the Saudis to lower their price on the Palestinians, get the Israelis to raise what the price they're willing to pay on the Palestinians, and create enough for both sides to do what they want to. This is possible. It's very unlikely, but it's possible. That's the deal that is most gettable. There you go.
Thank you. Hussein, I believe we've been joined by Ambassador Jeffery. Welcome. But I believe that Dr. Lawrence will speak first.
So I have two of my favorite speakers on my right and my left. I often appear with Ambassador Jeffery on TV sometimes, and I call Hussein almost every time I have a TV appearance to fill me in on the latest. And he does that. I call him up, I give him my topic, and Hussein does what he just did, and I get very smart from
No joke.
Yeah.
It actually happens all the time.
Yeah, I get very smart from my interviews.
Several times a week.
Yeah, exactly. I've had the privilege and tragic circumstance since October 7th of doing over 400 television interviews on U.S. policy to the region, and not because I'm an expert as you are on Gaza and all that. Well, I've been teaching it, but I'm certainly not what I worked on at the State Department. But because having been a former diplomat with this gentleman and others, I think I have some insights into how the U.S. government works, how it thinks, why it does what it does, and I have to say I just got back from the region, and because of all the TV, I was being recognized everywhere, and the first thing absolutely everyone said is, I'm only listening to you. Like, when you're talking, I'm listening, and the other guys, they're not saying much. And I think and this has been a leitmotif of my whole life, most people who give advice to governments have no idea how governments work. And most people in government don't really dip in enough to the think tank world, the analytical world, and internalize those concepts and operationalize them. We had a big problem when I was at Crisis Group because there was a camp that didn't even want to give recommendations. And I don't think the problem was giving recommendations or not, which is the first thing everybody reads when they read a Crisis Group report. It's that our recommendations weren't very good. And so, that was part of my job. The couple of years I spent in there was trying to figure out what are governments actually potentially going to do. And I was thinking about that listening to you speak right now, and then how would they go about it? And the art of politics, the art of the possible, the art of what Trump had ghostwritten for him but didn't really ever implement.
Tony Schwartz.
It really is doing like Jose Andres did in his video. It's constantly adapting to the changing circumstance and looking for the possibility of the moment. That's what politics are all about. That's why all these political leaders reading the headlines every morning, because they're looking for openings. They're looking for a breakthrough on something that wasn't working for the last couple of months. They've been thinking about it, but they're hoping there's a moment right now where they can do something in the changing circumstance. I remember, just to give you an example of how extreme this gets, when I was in diplomatic training, we learned about the enterprising State Department desk officer who stopped a war in Liberia simply by making a call to the Pentagon and convincing them to move a ship a little closer to Monrovia, before and that's all it took. But it was somebody who understood the moment and understood the small thing because sometimes it's almost like reverse chaos theory, like
yeah.
there's a butterfly. I mean, you can do little things at key moments that have huge impacts. And that's the art of politics. I was also thinking.
It's called feed forward.
Yeah. I was also thinking as he was speaking about, we used to say the most important thing that happened in the Middle East to set the course for everything was the Iranian Revolution. And then we used to say the Iraq War. And then after 2011, we said Arab Spring. That's that. And for me, I keep going back to the Arab Spring. I'm also writing a book on the Arab Spring right now and how it was mistold, called Stolen Spring. But the Arab Spring revealed all the vulnerabilities we're often avoiding talking about. And the Arab Spring started as people against regimes, and then became regimes against people, and then became people against people, and then became regimes against regimes. And I won't go through all the taxonomy of what happened, but all of that exposed vulnerabilities. And the idea, notwithstanding some of the great speeches we've heard today and over this conference, the idea that Trump can come in and sort of wave some wand, right, and all of these fragilities are going to disappear in the night, is laughable. He doesn't understand it and he can't do it. And so, until we deal with all of the different angles I just talked about, the relationships between regimes and people, the relationships within those countries, between the various groups, and the relationships between states that often have long histories of conflict and deep resentments and traumas and collective traumas and all that, until we're dealing with the complexity of the history, we're scratching the surface. And I'm also tired, just as we get to the Trump side, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about Trump and writing about Trump and traveling, as I said, with Trump and all the Trump stuff. And I'm tired of hearing we don't know what's coming. We know exactly what's coming. And then they'll say, well, he's unpredictable. Yeah, but that's predictable. Yeah. Trump's unpredictability, and then how he acts unpredictably in moments, is entirely predictable. So all you have to know is the last person you talk to, you're right, and then you'll find out what he's saying in the next meeting, And so, the idea that somehow Trump's going to accomplish things, I fall right back into what Hussein was just saying. If we get peace immediately in the Middle East, it's because Netanyahu wants to give a gift to Trump that he will negotiate, and then Trump will be able to take credit for it. And that will be all engineered as part of the deal. And
it would be someone else, that's for sure.
Right.
Might not be Netanyahu, but it's somebody else.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the gift track. The next thing I would say, and it's a phrase I picked up in one panel I was listening to lately, there won't be a peace negotiation. There absolutely won't be a peace negotiation. There'll be a political negotiation. There'll be an arrangement. There'll be some kind of stopgap measure, the way that my friend was talking about. But I would beg to differ with him on one thing, and it's not to laud Trump, but it's just to sort of think about something. My friends worked, and I know Mohammed cut it out of his remarks, Mohammed Abu al-Anin, so I'm going to stick it back into this conversation. The Trump administration did a masterful job of almost getting a deal between Egypt and Ethiopia. Yeah. And it was run out of Treasury Department. They brought in the best people. They were really, really close to a deal. And then Ethiopia backed out at the last minute. But it was... and I'm not saying the terms of it were perfect, and it's an issue I've worked on a lot. But I will say that Trump, almost despite himself, almost got an Ethiopia.
Well, there was the maritime deal, right? Amos Hochstein's maritime deal, a triangular deal between Israel, Lebanon, and the United States. That's pretty good, but
and then I'll flash over.
Not anything he ever heard of, I'm sure.
And then I'll flash over the Afghanistan negotiations too. We had a bad deal for Afghanistan that Biden badly implemented, but there was that deal with the Taliban that they love to laud, and that stuff. But all to say is that deals are possible in a Trump presidency, and deals are doable if the right stars align and the contexts happen. But it's as much up to the people in this room, as it is the White House. I mean, I'm really serious about this. You almost have to, and I've known this dealing with a lot of senior leaders in my political side of my career. You have to, you don't give problems to your leaders. You give solutions, right? So it's the lower levels. It's the people with an idea. It's the people who understand the context and seize the moment that can hand a leader, a deal that then can sign off on. And there's no less reason that if they don't fire everybody, in the Trump administration, you know, that reasonably good federal bureaucrats and State Department people could come up with deals on this and deals on that, which is what my article about the first year of the Trump administration is. A whole bunch of good things happened on Ethiopia and Sudan, other issues, because Trump wasn't getting in the way, and the White House was managing Trump. You know, and so yeah.
Given the time constraints?
Oh yeah. So I'll conclude, given all that, is that what we learn in negotiation theory, thinking about deals, is the BATNA, right? You learn about the best alternative to the negotiated agreement. And right now, Israel does not have a reason to make a deal. They have the reason to make war. Hamas has a reason to make war, not a deal. Hezbollah has a reason to make war, not a deal. You know, and so the idea that somehow the BATNA situation's gonna shift, I think, anytime soon, means that we're not gonna have any sustainable solutions. We're gonna have stopgap measures, and if we get them, we should laud them. 2 days of peace, as the Egyptians were fighting for, is better than no days of peace. So the stopgap's okay, but until we start dealing with the deep fragilities, long traumas, and structural inequities in the region, any deals are going to be fragile and fraught and not go very far. And that's what we should be thinking about. And I'd like to hand it over to.
Thank you, William. Ambassador Jeffery, would you take the floor?
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for having me here today. And my mic is now on. First of all, although I served in the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, I can't predict what Trump is going to do. That's risky with any president coming in. It's even risky when they have a second term or even in the midst of the term they're in, and particularly so with Trump. But you have an objective situation, which is the Middle East is in crisis right now. And it may get better before the 20th of January. I'm a bit more optimistic than my colleague to my right is, but it well might not, so it will become Trump's problem. So what are we dealing with here? Okay, I'm going to disagree a little bit with what you've heard a bit, but let's start with the crisis since the 7th of October, although this is more general than that. Almost everything I read about that is wrong because it takes one of two perspectives. One is a sort of, let's look at the root causes. In the case of the October 7th, it's clearly going back to 1947 and earlier, Palestinians and Jews, or Arabs and Jews at the time, on the same territory, and how do you sort this thing out, as well as many other problems that are inherent to the State of Israel, and particularly to the internal composition and constitution of the leading Palestinian organizations. And you have to keep a focus on that. But if you focus only on that and other particulars of this, and to some degree that's been a problem of the Biden administration, getting hostages back, going for a ceasefire, de-escalation, this is what I call their game book for any crisis in the Middle East, particularly a crisis with Iran. And I know it because I've been doing it for 3 administrations, less with the Trump, but to some degree still, and certainly with the Obama and Bush administrations. And the game book doesn't work because you have to keep in mind the other issue, which is the first and by far most important security problem in the Middle East is Iran's hegemonic desire to control the region. We can look into the religious, ideological, and historical factors that have driven that. We can try to make excuses, people do. Oh, look what happened to Mossadegh in 1953. Oh, bullshit. They didn't overthrow the emperor of Iran over an issue that occurred 20 years earlier, and you'll notice we didn't lift a finger to protect the Shah during that period of time. We let it happen. And what did we get for it? We got an embassy seized, and on and on and on. That was deliberate. That's their ideology. It's similar in terms of the impact on a region as to what we see now with Putin in Asia, or rather Europe. And I'm getting ahead of myself. Possibly China and Asia, I'm not sure I would put China in the same category. And if you ignore that, or try to explain it away, which to of the last 4 administrations did almost totally. Trump in the first 2 years to some degree did. Then he focused on Iran in the region. The Biden administration tried to go back to the Obama policy, but October 7th made that impossible. So you're dealing with two separate issues: the specifics of an individual conflict, and you've got a package of things with the Gaza war. You've got a package of things with Lebanon going back to 1701 in 2006, the UN resolution, but going deeply into the history of Lebanon, Israeli involvement, the divisions within the country. You can do the same thing with the Houthis in Yemen. You can do the same thing with the many factions that I and others in this room have dealt with in Iraq. And those are important things, and you can't ignore them. But you also have the same problems in Libya. You have kind of similar problems in Jordan. You have them all over the Middle East. What makes a set of problems, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza, different is Iran. It is the factor. Take Libya. I would defy you to make the argument that Libya is any simpler or has fewer outside powers involved than Syria. But it's kind of under control, because the one power that isn't actively involved in it is Iran. So I sound like I'm obsessed with Iran. I'm not. I realize that you have to take into consideration, as we just heard, the local issues and the local situation and the local, typically, dysfunctionalities to deal with the problem. But you cannot leave out of mind the Iranian problem, and we did. Basically, multiple administrations and the Israelis, by and large, the one exception was when they ignored our advice, and I was one of the people giving it to them: don't bomb the Syrian reactor in 2006. This will escalate. This will lead to a regional catastrophe. Have you all heard that before? I've heard it maybe 50 times in the last year from senior administration officials to every single thing that Israel has done. Now, I'm not happy with a lot of the tactics and some of the specifics that they have done, particularly vis-a-vis innocent civilians, but all in all, militarily, as somebody who used to do this for a living in the U.S. Army, it made sense. And their advice didn't make sense, not only because it made no military sense under the specific conditions, but it simply reflected a failed policy over 20 years. So as I said, the one time the Israelis didn't listen to us, they went in and hit the Al-Qaeda nuclear site. Imagine the Syrian war if Assad not only had chemical weapons, but a few nukes. So thank you, Israel, for that one. But that's the problem that we had. Look at Iran in the year 2000. It had been defeated twice by a coalition backing Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war, roughly by 1988. Then in the tanker war with us decisively at about the same time. I had two relatively moderate, by Iranian standards, presidents, Rafsanjani and Khatami. And other than the Cobalt Towers attack and the attack on Argentina, it had been basically quasi-well-behaved. Obviously, it had its long-term ambitions to destroy Israel, throw us out of the region, and establish hegemony, and it was working throughout the region. It only had one proxy at the time, not 5 or 6 as they do now, and that was Hezbollah, and it only had one ally, Assad. And at the time, it was a supplicant to Assad, who was in a far better position than an isolated Iran was. Look at it on the 6th of October. 5 countries, basically, state capture, more or less. Syria and Iraq, not quite. Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza, essentially by an Iranian proxy. Not that they don't have their own issues, not that you don't have to learn about the tribal differences and the personalities and the specific complaints, because these are, and I went through this for 20 years in Southeast Asia, these are quasi-independent proxies. They're supported by the central power, Iran in the case of the Middle East, Communist China up to 72 in the Far East, who supports them in various ways but lets them find their own way forward, flowing like water through the stones and rocks. And so we ignored that. We had other priorities, as did the Arab states and Israel during that period. We had knocking out Saddam, we had 9/11, Al-Qaeda, then later the Islamic State. We had, as you've heard, the Arab Spring. We had bringing democracy to the region. We had the Israeli-Palestinian never-ending effort to get something going on the basis of the Oslo Accords. And, of course, we had the Iranian nuclear count, the one part of Iran that we took seriously. For the rest of it, it was all, this isn't serious. The Iranians very quietly, in an asymmetric way, inched their way forward, made it difficult to us to intervene in these messy gray zone conflicts. And, as I said, look where they were on the 6th of October. Then they made a big mistake, or not they, but one of their underlings, Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, and they decided that they would push forward and do something truly dramatic that would shake the Middle East. And if the documents that the Israelis got that the New York Times published about Sinwar's efforts to recruit Hezbollah and Iran to this endeavor are accurate, Israel is facing an even more serious existential threat. So Israel has reacted. The United States, still clinging to its game plan, de-escalate, let's find a ceasefire, let's focus on the specific things, nonetheless has been dragged along. And we're in a position today where either the Biden administration in its last 2 months or the Trump administration can move this forward. Israel has achieved most everything it can achieve militarily in Lebanon and in Gaza at this point. As we learned with the Islamic State, you can defeat a force like that, an ideological force, as a organized conventional military force that occupies territory, but you can't kill them all. You can't destroy the ideology. They go underground, and you have to deal with them in that basis. And the way to deal with them is, as we heard, some kind of deal, inevitably temporary, that pushes the problem down the road. In the case of Gaza, it is getting through a ceasefire where Hamas promises not to shoot at anybody, not just the Israelis, but whoever comes in to try to run the place, rather like the Republika Srpska people agreed to in Bosnia. An international stabilization and reconstruction effort is launched. The hostages come back, and the Israeli forces withdraw. That can work, but it requires Israel to realize that it's now in a diminishing return on investment path with its military activities, and of course it requires Hamas to agree to a ceasefire and return of the hostages in return for the Israelis going back. Basically the 31 May agreement originally proposed by the Israelis and then announced by the president. In Lebanon, it's the same thing, not the same thing in specifics, but the idea is that Hezbollah pulls back. There will have to be some kind of control. We tried to do this in the 2006 resolution, 1701. We failed to block weapons coming across the border from Syria or coming in through the airport, and a more robust international peacekeeper presence and a more robust Lebanese army in the south. Both of these things can happen and will, as we've heard, allow the Trump administration to do what it wants, which is to reign over a relatively peaceful region, get Israel and Saudi Arabia to move closer and build on the Abraham Accords. So that's the positive scenario. I'll leave it to others and the audience to talk about the many alternatives to the positive scenario. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Yes, some of the questions from the audience are...
Can I make a quick point?
Yeah, okay.
I thought it was fascinating, but I do just want to interject that sometimes warnings are not wrong. And I'll point out two instances where warnings were not wrong. One, those of us who were saying, don't invade Iraq in 2003, and if you're going to do it, don't do it in this damn silly way, I think can feel somewhat validated. And the dissolution of the Iraqi army was the equivalent of dissolving the Iraqi state, and we're still living with the consequences. Much of what you described is the consequence of people not listening to that warning. So that warning was the right one. The other one was those of us who've been saying for the past 20 years that unless there was some sort of a framework, some sort of a light at the end of the tunnel for Palestinians, some pathway for them to gain their freedom and gain their human rights, other than violence, there was going to be, not probably, not maybe, not could be, inevitably guaranteed going to be an explosion of horrendous violence coming out of the occupied territories aimed at Israel at some point. We couldn't have told you it was October of last year. We couldn't have told you it was Gaza or Hamas, but that it would happen was inevitable. And we were not making it up. We were not kidding, and we were not guessing. It was going to happen. And as long as there's no path forward, it will happen again. And I think those warnings are valid ones. So I just want to say that not all warnings are fatuous blather.
I would just like to add, because I think some of that was directed at me, you're absolutely right on the first warning. As I said, and you cited the biggest of our many mistakes in the region over the last 20 years, Israel pulling out of, the way it pulled out of both southern Lebanon and Gaza without any understanding of what would happen afterwards, or any, well, we'll go back in if X, Y, and Z doesn't happen. The Saudis and Emiratis are listening to us. They had shot their way into Hodeidah in June of 2018. The Trump administration, I want to underline, pulled the plug on that thing because the UN guy on the scene, Griffiths, who later became very active in the last year on Gaza before he finally retired, did the usual, civilian casualties, this is going to be a catastrophe, you have to stop it. So we stopped it. He said, we'll negotiate the withdrawal of both. The Emiratis, Saudis, and Yemeni forces withdrew. Obviously, the Houthis are still there. And on the other one, you're absolutely right, and I criticize the Israelis, but this isn't a one-sided thing. Even before a two-state solution, which I think we may have gone down the wrong road for 30 years using that, what you basically have is territory occupied after a war of aggression against Israel in 1967. And what you need is a way forward for the Israelis to leave that territory.
There's a problem with that, is that Israel actually started the war.
No, the problem with that is Israel launched a preemptive attack.
Yeah, you can call it that if you like, but before the Israeli attack on Egypt and Syria, there wasn't a war. And the 5 minutes after the Israeli attack on Egypt and Syria, there was a war. So you can call it a preemptive. No, hold on. You can call it preemptive. You can justify it. You can say they were right to do it. You can say it was valid. But you can't say they didn't start it. But they did. It's a matter of fact that they started it.
They fired the first shots. They fired the first shots
QED, sir. QED.
Hours before 3 Arab states launched an attack that had been long planned. That's a reality.
I mean, fine.
But even if, hold on, even if the Israelis did launch the attack, the point is a war occurred between countries that were at war since 1948,
Yes.
and the Israelis occupied territory.
Yes.
Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, Sinai,
Yeah.
Gaza, and the West Bank.
Now we're back on historical fact. Very well done.
The basic issue here, from somebody like me who has worked not just in the Middle East, but in things like Berlin and the Far East, is once a war is ended and you're occupying hostile territory, how do you get out of there? It's illegal under international law to stay there forever. And to the extent the Israelis talk about annexation, that's a violation of illegal law. But it's not illegal to stay there.
Right.
As long as you have said, these are my security provisions.
Sure.
The Israelis did this with the Egyptians, and with a lot of help from us, it was worked out within a decade. The Soviets, now let me finish. The Soviets did this with Berlin. We never for a day said that their occupation of Berlin was illegal, and finally, they got the deal they wanted, which was no NATO troops in Eastern Germany and a variety of other concessions, and so they left. So the question is, what can get the Israelis to leave from the standpoint of protecting their security?
Yeah.
That's the issue that Oslo
If
tried.
we continue, there won't be any opportunity for anyone in the audience to have a question, because we have about 5 minutes.
It's a minor
left. So
matter of the settlements, but that's all right.
The two questions are, that seem to come from the audience are, is Israel going to take advantage of the current situation to escalate against Iran, to take this regional threat out when it is possible? And is Israel going to continue with this policy of making Gaza uninhabitable and making life in the West Bank intolerable? Again, while it has the opportunity. The
No.
American public seems indifferent. The Israeli public seems to be behind the government. So, and as you said, Hussein,
Yeah.
if this is not resolved, you can take to the bank that there will be another eruption of violence by Palestinians against Israelis when these 10-year-old boys who've lost their mother and their father and sister and brother come of age.
The annexationists are counting on it, right? They're going to annex the West Bank crying. They're going to say it's the last thing we wanted to do. But we have to be the adults here. We have to draw the line. We have no choice. It has to be us over here and them over there. Oops, a lot of them ended up on the other side of the war. Well, that's all for the better because this is saving lives, you know. We have to do this. So the answer to those questions is no and yes in order. No, the Israelis are not going to escalate with Iran now. And yes, they will continue to behave abominably in the occupied territories because of the attitudes. I'm going to stop.
And the other panelists, how do you answer those questions?
I agree entirely with Hussein that they're not going to escape Israel, that both sides are avoiding that, and there are plenty of others helping them avoid it. I do believe that they're going to continue to misbehave, and I think that's sort of the main point that I made, which is that if you don't deal with the internals, then you're not dealing with the problem. And I was hearing all this Iran talk. I'm the last supporter of Iran or Hamas or Hezbollah or any of that. And I buy into all the proxy talk that I've heard today. But when I hear that Iran is the problem, you know, the question I wanted to ask last night, well, it takes two to tango. You know, like Iran is a symptom of the problem as much as it's the problem, right? The problem is miserable populations being treated miserably. And the way I describe the conflict is a multi-generationally traumatized population oppressing a multi-generationally traumatized population. That's not Iran's fault. That's not Iran's problem. Iran operates the way that was beautifully described in one of the panels this morning, that it takes that situation because it's the only card it can play, and then doesn't play all these other cards that wouldn't work as well for Iran. But again, you know, just like I often say that Islamism is the symptom of problems rather than the cause of problems, Iran is as much a symptom of the problem as anything else.
But
Iran
those are
would have no traction.
the problem is those are cancerous symptoms.
Right.
So they're symptoms, but they're
Right.
cancerous symptoms.
Yeah.
So the other questions from the audience are how are the GCC states and other Arab states going to respond if, for example, we leave Iran in place and they buy time to rebuild some of their assets? And how are the GCCs going to respond if the current Israeli government drags its feet and does nothing to accommodate Palestinians or makes their life unbearable?
I'll take the last. Real quick on the first two, I agree. We have unanimity here. I don't think the Israelis are going to try to do anything more with Iran, and I don't think Iran's going to try to do anything more if they're smart with Israel. On the misbehaving in Gaza, in the West Bank, unless the Trump administration makes clear that that must not happen, it will happen to one or another degree under this Israeli government, not necessarily under another one. But with those two conditions, Trump doesn't intervene and this Israeli government stays in power, absolutely. On the third one, which is the most interesting because it pulls in everything, Iran has militarily and psychologically suffered a huge defeat. It's lost one of its proxies, Hamas, possibly permanently, and its most powerful one has been defeated to a degree none of us thought was possible. And Iran itself has been shown to be a paper tiger, and thus the time is ripe for Iran to do some rethinking of its role in the region and what it wants to do. You see this in the current government, but we all know that Iran is a two-faced beast. You have the real deep state, which is the supreme leader in the IRGC, and you have the guys you meet at international conferences, and I've met them at international conferences, who typically sound reasonable, and then something blows up in the region. So I think that there's some flexibility. I think that the GCC states, who've been very helpful to indirectly Israel, but to the United States in the last year, I think that they have flexibility to try to move forward. And I think that the Abraham Accords could go further, as we've heard, but that requires a real change in Israeli attitudes towards the Palestinians, to a lesser degree, but I can't leave it out, Palestinian attitudes towards Israel. To quote Avi Shavit, who's from the Israeli left, we thought it was all about 1967, i.e. 2 states in the West Bank and Gaza. They think it's all about 1948. That may be a bit unfair, but it does reflect some of the thinking in Israel on the left, let alone the right.
Yeah, on the
last word
GCC.
will go to Hussein because we have run out of time.
But I do have thoughts about the GCC and its attitude towards Iran, right? So the GCC basically over the, and especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but all of them, have come to the conclusion in the past 5 years, 10 years, especially past 5 years, the end of the Obama term and then during Trump, that neither participation in an American-led containment agenda nor diplomacy with Iran alone suffices. So you need a bit of both. Underneath, under the radar, you cooperate with the U.S. and you try to get along with the containment regime and what have you, and that's good. And then above ground, you have your own dialogue. Now, what could shift them is if the United States were to offer an update to the Carter Doctrine, a more clear sense of when they would act kinetically to protect these states. Abqaiq and Khurais was the great inflection point, right? Trump shrugged and did nothing. And so these countries are not going to enter into another major campaign of containment against Iran and pressure and wait to get punched in the face again. Because that's exactly what happened last time, right? That was the Iranian response to Trump's sanctions was a smash in the face of Saudi Arabia and nothing happened. So unless they can be assured that actually that's not going to happen again and they're not going to get punched in the face again because they join a containment regime and a pressure regime against Iran, they won't do it. So there has got to be an understanding that they are not going to stick their necks out to no purpose.
Thank you for a lively discussion. We have to make way for General Petraeus and the next session.